August 12, 1944. Camp Florence, Arizona. The afternoon heat shimmered off the desert floor as Staff Sergeant Michael Russo watched the convoy of trucks roll through the main gate, carrying cargo that would challenge everything he thought he understood about war, duty, and the invisible lines that separated victor from vanquished. Inside those canvas-covered vehicles sat 43 Italian women, prisoners of war, their faces marked by exhaustion and apprehension as they arrived at a facility designed for men, adapted hastily for circumstances no military manual had adequately prepared anyone to handle. Russo had been warned they were coming, had read the briefing papers explaining that these were not combatants but auxiliary personnel captured during the Allied advance through Italy, women who had served in administrative and support roles for Mussolini's crumbling regime. What the briefing papers had not prepared him for was the moment when the first woman stepped down from the truck, her worn shoes touching American soil, and looked at him with eyes that held neither defiance nor surrender but something far more unsettling, a cautious curiosity about what kind of captivity awaited her in this strange desert land so far from the olive groves and ancient stones of home. In his hand, Russo held the week's menu requisition form, listing items that would become the catalyst for a cultural collision nobody had anticipated: ribeye steaks, pork ribs, sweet corn, fresh bread, and all the fixings for what the camp commander had casually called a proper American welcome. That decision, made with the best of intentions by men who could not fathom how food might become a battlefield of its own, would transform a routine prisoner processing into something that exposed the vast chasms between worlds, between the desperate scarcity of a defeated nation and the almost incomprehensible abundance of American wartime plenty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Michael Russo had not expected to spend his war in the Arizona desert playing host to prisoners who challenged every assumption he had carried into uniform. The son of Italian immigrants from South Philadelphia, he had grown up speaking the language at home, eating his grandmother's cooking, and hearing stories about the old country that always carried an undertone of loss mixed with gratitude for the opportunities America provided. When war came, he had enlisted without hesitation, driven by the same patriotic fervor that swept through immigrant communities determined to prove their American loyalty. His language skills had seemed like they would guarantee him a posting to the European theater, perhaps as an interpreter during the invasion of Italy itself. Instead, the army in its infinite and inscrutable wisdom had assigned him to Camp Florence, a prisoner of war facility in the middle of nowhere, where his Italian would be useful primarily for managing the growing population of captured enemy personnel who found themselves spending the war in a desert that bore no resemblance to anything in their experience. The camp itself was a study in contradictions. Built rapidly after America's entry into the war, it sprawled across several hundred acres of scrubland, its perimeter marked by wire fencing and guard towers that seemed almost apologetic in their presence. This was not Dachau or Buchenwald. The Geneva Convention governed every aspect of its operation, and the American military took those obligations seriously, perhaps overly so in the eyes of some civilians who question why enemies should receive 3 meals a day when rationing imposed hardships on American families. The male prisoners, mostly Italian soldiers captured in North Africa, had been here for over a year. They worked in agriculture, picking cotton and vegetables for local farms desperate for labor as American workers flooded into defense industries. The arrangement benefited everyone. Farmers got workers, prisoners earned small wages and stayed occupied, and the local economy hummed along despite wartime disruptions. But women prisoners presented complications that nobody had fully thought through. They could not be housed with the men. They could not perform the same labor. They required separate facilities, separate supervision, and most challenging of all, separate treatment that acknowledged both their status as prisoners and their vulnerability as women in a system designed entirely around male captives. The decision to bring them to Camp Florence had been made at levels far above Russo's authority, driven by overcrowding at the only other facility housing Italian women and by the calculation that the desert location provided security while the existing infrastructure could be adapted quickly. Russo had been appointed their primary liaison, the bridge between the prisoners and the camp administration, precisely because of his language skills and his heritage. The camp commander, Colonel Harrison Webb, a career officer from Virginia who spoke only English and possessed the kind of patrician bearing that came from generations of military service, had made his expectations clear during their meeting 3 days before the women's arrival. Webb had leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his considerable midsection, and fixed Russo with a look that combined authority with something approaching paternal concern. The sergeant needed to understand that this was not just about security and discipline. These women were defeated, far from home, and probably terrified despite whatever brave faces they showed. They would be treated with dignity and respect. They would receive the same rations as American personnel, per Geneva Convention requirements. They would be provided with adequate housing, medical care, and opportunities for recreation and correspondence with families back home. And critically, they would be integrated into camp life in ways that demonstrated American values, that showed them what democracy and prosperity looked like even in wartime. Webb had paused then, his expression becoming almost philosophical. This war would end eventually, he had said, and these women would return to Italy with stories about their captivity. Those stories mattered. They would shape Italian perceptions of America for generations. The camp's responsibility was not just to house prisoners but to win minds through fair treatment and generosity that contrasted sharply with Axis propaganda about American brutality. Russo had understood the political dimension, but he had also recognized something Webb either did not see or chose not to acknowledge. The colonel was proposing to feed women who came from a nation experiencing genuine hunger the kind of meals that would seem fantastical to civilians in Rome or Milan. The disconnect between intention and likely reception troubled him, though he had not voiced his concerns. Questioning orders was not his place, and besides, perhaps Webb was right. Perhaps abundance would speak more eloquently than any propaganda. Now, watching the women file into the administration building for processing, Russo found himself studying their faces and bearing for clues about what they were thinking. They ranged in age from late teens to perhaps 50, though malnutrition and stress made ages difficult to estimate. Their clothing was shabby but clean, suggesting efforts to maintain dignity despite circumstances. Some carried small bags containing whatever possessions they had managed to keep through capture and transport. Others had nothing beyond the clothes they wore. Their expressions varied. A few looked around with open curiosity, taking in the strange landscape and the efficiency of the camp's operations. Others kept their eyes down, focused on the ground, as though making themselves small might provide protection. Several clustered together, whispering in rapid Italian that Russo's position near the doorway allowed him to overhear. They were speculating about what would happen to them. One woman, perhaps 30 years old with dark hair pulled back severely, wondered aloud if they would be forced into labor camps like prisoners in Germany. Another, younger and visibly frightened, asked if Americans executed prisoners. A third, older and apparently possessing some authority among the group, quietly but firmly corrected these fears. The Americans were not Germans. They followed rules. Whatever awaited them would be bearable. They simply needed to remain calm and cooperative. Russo felt an unexpected wave of emotion listening to these exchanges. These were not ideological fanatics or hardened soldiers. They were ordinary women swept up in the machinery of war, now finding themselves in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. His grandmother could have been among them had history taken a slightly different turn, had the family remained in Naples instead of emigrating, had Mussolini's alliance with Hitler drawn Italy into conflict a generation earlier. The thought troubled him in ways he had not anticipated. The processing took hours. Each woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. Personal information was recorded in triplicate. Medical examinations were conducted by the camp's 2 nurses, both American women whose presence seemed to provide some reassurance. Belongings were catalogued. Then came the orientation briefing that Russo delivered in Italian, explaining the camp rules, the daily schedule, the work expectations, and the rights guaranteed under the Geneva Convention. He emphasized that they would be treated fairly, that complaints could be filed through proper channels, that correspondence with families would be permitted subject to censorship, and that cooperation would make everyone's lives easier. The women listened with varying degrees of attention. Some seemed to absorb every word, nodding slightly as he explained procedures. Others appeared too exhausted or overwhelmed to focus. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One woman near the back, tall and thin with prematurely gray hair, caught his eye by asking a question that cut through the bureaucratic recitation. When would they eat? They had been traveling for 2 days with minimal food, and hunger had become the dominating reality of their existence. Russo consulted his watch. It was nearly 5 in the afternoon. The evening meal would be served at 6. He told her this, adding that the food here would be plentiful and that they should eat as much as they needed to regain their strength. The woman's expression remained skeptical, as though promises of plentiful food were the kind of lies prisoners learned to dismiss. What Russo did not tell them, because he himself did not yet fully understand what was about to happen, was that the evening meal had been planned as something special. Colonel Webb, in consultation with the camp's mess officer, had decided that the women's first dinner should be memorable, a demonstration of American hospitality that would set the tone for their captivity. The menu reflected this ambition in ways that would have seemed extravagant even at a stateside officers' club. Grilled ribeye steaks, each cut weighing nearly a pound. Barbecued pork ribs glazed with a sauce made from molasses, vinegar, and spices. Sweet corn on the cob dripping with butter. Fresh baked bread still warm from the ovens. Green beans cooked with bacon. Mashed potatoes topped with gravy. And for dessert, apple pie with vanilla ice cream. The meal represented more than generosity. It embodied a particularly American form of cultural expression, the belief that abundance demonstrated superiority, that providing plenty proved the righteousness of one's cause. For men like Webb who had grown up in comfort and assumed that prosperity was the natural order, feeding defeated enemies lavishly seemed both practical and philosophical. It was practical because well-fed prisoners caused fewer problems. It was philosophical because it demonstrated the difference between democratic plenty and fascist scarcity. But for the women being led toward the mess hall as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the meal would represent something else entirely, a confrontation with an abundance so extreme it felt like mockery. The mess hall had been hastily adapted from a building originally designed to feed male prisoners in shifts. Long tables ran the length of the room, benches on either side, with serving lines at one end where camp personnel would distribute food onto trays. The smell hit first as the women entered, a rich combination of grilled meat, smoke, butter, and baking bread that was so intense and so foreign to recent experience that several women stopped just inside the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed. Russo, walking alongside the group, watched their reactions and felt the first stirrings of doubt about what was about to unfold. In the serving line, the mess staff had prepared for the prisoners with the same efficiency they brought to feeding American personnel. Enormous platters held the steaks and ribs. Huge pots contained the corn and vegetables. Baskets overflowed with bread. The quantities seemed designed to demonstrate that rationing, whatever hardships it imposed on civilians back home, did not apply here in this desert camp where American power and prosperity could be displayed without reservation. The first woman approached the serving line with her tray held uncertainly. She was young, perhaps 20, with dark eyes that darted nervously between the food and the servers. The mess sergeant, a cheerful man from Texas who treated cooking as a calling, greeted her with a smile and began loading her tray. A steak that covered half the tray surface. 3 ribs that extended beyond the edges. Corn, beans, potatoes, and 2 thick slices of bread. The tray became so heavy that the woman struggled to lift it. She said something in Italian, too quietly for Russo to hear, but the mess sergeant simply smiled broader and gestured for her to move along so the next person could be served. One by one, the women filed through the line, each receiving portions that would have fed a family for days in wartime Italy. Their reactions varied. Some accepted the food with expressions that suggested they suspected a trick. Others stared at their trays with something approaching disbelief. A few tried to refuse portions, attempting to hand back the meat or bread, only to be cheerfully but firmly redirected by servers who seemed to interpret resistance as shyness rather than genuine reluctance. By the time all 43 women had been served and were seated at the tables, the mess hall had fallen into an unusual quiet. Normally, meal times generated conversation, the clatter of utensils, the sound of eating. But now the women simply sat, staring at the food before them as though it might be an illusion that would vanish if touched. Russo stood near the doorway, watching, beginning to understand that something had gone profoundly wrong despite everyone's good intentions. The woman who had asked about food earlier, the tall one with gray hair, was the first to pick up her utensils. She cut a small piece of steak, examined it carefully, then placed it in her mouth. Her expression as she chewed was impossible to read, somewhere between pleasure and pain, gratitude and grief. She swallowed, set down her fork, and sat motionless for a long moment before cutting another piece. Others began to follow her example, though hesitantly. The younger woman who had struggled with her tray attempted one of the ribs, taking a small bite of meat and immediately grimacing at the sweetness of the barbecue sauce. She set it down and turned instead to the bread, eating it plain, without butter, as though even that was almost too rich. An older woman at a different table touched each item on her tray systematically, her fingers brushing the steak, the corn, the beans, as if she needed tactile confirmation of their reality before she could bring herself to eat. Then the crying started. It began with one woman, seated near the center of the hall, who had managed several bites before suddenly dropping her fork and covering her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs that she tried to muffle but could not entirely suppress. The sound seemed to release something in others. Within moments, half a dozen women were crying openly, tears running down their faces as they sat before trays of food that would have seemed like treasures just months earlier but now felt like accusations. Russo moved instinctively toward them, though he had no clear idea what he could say or do. As he approached, he heard fragments of conversation through the tears. One woman was talking about her children, left with relatives in Rome, wondering if they had eaten today or would eat tomorrow. Another was remembering her husband, killed in North Africa, whose last letter had described desperate hunger in the weeks before his death. A third simply repeated the same phrase over and over, too much, too much, too much, as though the abundance itself was a form of cruelty. The woman with gray hair, who had been first to eat, stood and addressed the room in Italian that was calm but carried the weight of command. She reminded them where they were and who they were. Prisoners, yes, but also survivors who had endured capture and transport and uncertainty. This food, however much it might pain them to see it when others went hungry, was being offered freely. They should eat. They should build back their strength. Refusing the food helped no one and insulted the dead by suggesting their sacrifice demanded reciprocal suffering from the living. The speech had some effect. The crying subsided, though it did not stop entirely. Women began eating again, though the meal had lost whatever joy or satisfaction it might have provided. They ate mechanically, forcing down food their bodies needed but their hearts rejected. The quantities proved overwhelming. Most women ate perhaps a quarter of what had been served, leaving their trays still heaped with food that would have been precious beyond measure in Italy but here seemed merely excessive. Russo reported the evening's events to Colonel Webb the next morning, choosing his words carefully to convey what had happened without explicitly criticizing the decision to serve such an elaborate meal. Webb listened with an expression that suggested he was trying to understand something that lay outside his experience. When Russo finished, the colonel was silent for a long moment before speaking. He had meant it as a kindness, Webb said finally. A way to show these women that America did not treat prisoners with cruelty or neglect. He had thought providing excellent food would be appreciated, would demonstrate the difference between American values and the deprivation they had experienced under fascist rule. The fact that his generosity had caused distress troubled him, though he seemed uncertain about what lesson to draw from the experience. Russo suggested, as respectfully as possible, that perhaps the portions could be reduced to sizes less likely to overwhelm prisoners whose recent experience had been dominated by scarcity. Webb agreed immediately, seeming relieved to have a concrete action he could take. Meals would be adjusted. The women would still receive adequate nutrition, meeting Geneva Convention requirements, but the presentation would be modified to avoid the kind of cultural collision that had made the first dinner so difficult. but adjusting portion sizes did not address the deeper issue that the first meal had exposed. These women existed in a liminal space between worlds, between the desperate poverty of defeated Italy and the affluent pragmatism of wartime America. Everything about the camp, from the quantity of food to the quality of housing to the casual efficiency of operations, spoke of a nation whose relationship to material abundance was so fundamentally different from their own experience that comprehension seemed impossible. They were being treated well, by any objective standard, far better than Axis prisoners received in many nations. Yet that treatment itself became a daily reminder of defeat, of the vast gulf between victor and vanquished, of the uncomfortable reality that their enemy possessed so much plenty that even prisoners ate better than civilians in Rome. Over the following days, Russo found himself spending increasing time with the women, not just performing his official duties but engaging in conversations that went beyond the necessary. He discovered that several had worked as typists and clerks in military administration offices, managing paperwork for units that were now destroyed or scattered. Others had served in communications roles or supply coordination. A few had been teachers or nurses before the war, pressed into service as Italy's situation became increasingly desperate. None had expected to end up as prisoners in America, a fate that seemed both bizarre and strangely fortunate compared to what might have befallen them had they been captured by Soviet forces. The woman with gray hair, whose name was Lucia Marchetti, emerged as the informal leader among the prisoners. She had been a schoolteacher in Milan before the war, had lost her husband in the fighting in Albania, and had taken a position with the military primarily because it provided income to support her 2 teenage daughters. She spoke German as well as Italian, carried herself with quiet dignity, and possessed a pragmatic view of their situation that helped others adjust to captivity's realities. Russo found himself gravitating toward her for insights into how the group was coping and what issues might be developing beneath the surface calm. During one of their conversations, conducted in the shade of the administration building while other women participated in a recreation period, Lucia explained something that helped Russo understand the first dinner's emotional impact. The problem was not just quantity, she said, though that was part of it. The problem was the type of food. Steaks and ribs represented luxury items that ordinary Italians rarely consumed even before the war. Serving such food to prisoners felt like a deliberate display of superiority, a way of demonstrating that Americans could casually give to captives what Italian families could not provide their own children. She did not think this was the intention, she added quickly, noting that the Americans seemed genuinely confused by the prisoners' reactions. But intention mattered less than impact, and the impact had been to make explicit the power dynamics that made some people prisoners and others guards. Russo asked what would have been better. Lucia considered the question carefully before answering. Simpler food, she suggested. Bread, soup, vegetables, occasional meat but in modest portions that felt appropriate for prisoners rather than guests at a feast. Food that acknowledged their status without either punishing or overwhelming them. Americans seemed to believe that more was always better, that abundance proved virtue. Italians understood scarcity differently, knew that modest sufficiency carried its own dignity, that needs could be met without creating the kind of excess that made hunger elsewhere seem more acute by contrast. The conversation stayed with Russo long after it ended. He found himself viewing the camp through Lucia's perspective, seeing how American assumptions about normalcy appeared to people from profoundly different circumstances. The waste especially troubled him. American soldiers routinely left food on their trays, discarding portions that would have been precious to Italian civilians. The camp generated garbage in quantities that seemed obscene to women who had learned to use everything, to waste nothing, to find value in items Americans threw away without thought. This casual relationship to abundance spoke volumes about the relative positions of victor and vanquished, made clear who possessed the luxury of waste and who did not. As the weeks passed, routines developed that helped normalize the prisoners' presence. The women were assigned work duties, primarily in the camp laundry and administrative offices where their clerical skills could be utilized. They received small wages, per Geneva Convention requirements, which could be spent at the camp canteen on toiletries, writing paper, and other permitted items. They were allowed to write letters home, though mail moved slowly and many had not yet received responses. They participated in recreational activities, including a choir that formed spontaneously when several women discovered they shared a love of singing. And gradually, they began to eat the meals provided without the kind of emotional response that had marked the first dinner. But acceptance was not the same as comfort, and Russo increasingly recognized that the women existed in a state of permanent displacement that food exemplified but did not create. They were well-treated prisoners in a nation of plenty, and both parts of that description carried weight that could not be entirely reconciled. Well-treated because American values and international law demanded it. Prisoners because they had been on the losing side of a war that had destroyed their nation and scattered their families. The cognitive dissonance of being both simultaneously created tensions that emerged in unexpected moments and ways. One such moment came during a Sunday barbecue organized for the male prisoners, a regular event where men could socialize and enjoy food prepared outdoors in the warm evening air. Colonel Webb, believing that similar events might benefit the women, authorized a separate barbecue for them, with staff preparing hamburgers and hot dogs on grills set up near their housing area. The smell of cooking meat drew the women outside, where they watched the preparations with expressions that mixed curiosity with wariness. When the food was ready and served, the reactions were telling. Younger women, particularly those who had grown up in cities and possessed some familiarity with American culture from movies and magazines, approached the hamburgers with evident interest, seeming to view them as exotic novelties worth trying. Older women were more hesitant, examining the sandwiches with visible skepticism before taking cautious bites. Several tried the food, found it acceptable if strange, and ate modest portions. But others refused entirely, explaining through Russo that the food was too foreign, too American, too far removed from what they understood as proper meals. Lucia, eating a hamburger with the kind of methodical attention she brought to everything, offered an observation that crystallized the cultural divide. Americans, she said, seem to view food primarily as fuel, as something to be consumed efficiently without excessive ceremony. The hamburger exemplified this approach, everything compressed into a portable package that could be eaten quickly with minimal preparation or presentation. Italians understood food differently, as something tied to ritual, to family, to culture and identity in ways that made eating more than simple nutrition. The barbecue, for all its friendliness and evident good intentions, felt like eating in a foreign language, technically possible but somehow wrong at a fundamental level. The comment sparked a discussion among the women that Russo found himself facilitating despite not having intended to create a forum. They talked about food as memory, about dishes their mothers and grandmothers had prepared, about the way certain flavors could evoke specific moments and places. They talked about the gardens they had tended, the markets where they had shopped, the rituals of preparation and consumption that had structured daily life before the war disrupted everything. And they talked about loss, about the ways that being unable to cook their own food or share meals with families made their prisoner status feel more absolute than wire fences or guard towers ever could. One woman, younger than most of the others, began crying as she described making pasta with her grandmother, learning the techniques that had been passed down for generations. The war had taken her grandmother, killed in an Allied bombing raid on Genoa. The knowledge of how to make that particular pasta would die with the granddaughter unless she survived to teach others. Being here, eating American food in an American camp, felt like betraying that legacy, like allowing the war to sever connections that should have been maintained. The gathering, intended as recreation, had become something more complicated, an unplanned forum for grief and loss that food had somehow made explicit. Russo, standing on the margins and listening to conversations he only partially understood despite his linguistic fluency, felt the weight of what these women carried. They were not just prisoners. They were exiles from a world that war was destroying, people whose connection to home and culture and identity was being strained by every meal that reminded them of distance and displacement. He reported the barbecue's mixed success to Colonel Webb, though he struggled to articulate exactly what had happened or why food kept becoming problematic. Webb listened with the patient expression of a man trying to understand aliens from a distant planet. He seemed genuinely baffled by the idea that providing good food in generous quantities could cause distress. In his world, food was food. You ate what was served, felt grateful for plenty, and did not invest consumption with the kind of emotional significance that Russo was describing. The cultural divide between the colonel and the prisoners was not primarily about nationality. It was about class, about history, about fundamentally different relationships to scarcity and abundance that no amount of goodwill could entirely bridge. September brought monsoon rains that transformed the desert into something briefly green, and with the rains came a crisis that exposed fractures nobody had anticipated. 3 of the younger women fell seriously ill with what the camp doctor diagnosed as severe malnutrition complicated by the sudden dietary shift. Their bodies, adapted to months of scarcity, had reacted poorly to the abrupt introduction of rich foods in quantities their systems could not process. The doctor explained to Russo that starvation creates metabolic changes, that refeeding requires careful gradual increases rather than immediate abundance. The irony was bitter. American generosity, motivated by genuine humanitarian concern, had made prisoners sick precisely because it had been too generous too quickly. Colonel Webb ordered immediate changes to meal protocols. New arrivals would receive smaller portions of simpler foods, with quantities increased gradually over several weeks as their bodies adjusted. The women already in camp would have their meals modified to reduce fats and proteins that their digestive systems struggled to handle. A nutritionist was brought in from Phoenix to develop menus that balanced Geneva Convention requirements against medical realities. What had seemed straightforward, feed prisoners adequately, revealed itself as complex, requiring expertise that ordinary military administration had not provided. The illness frightened the other women in ways that went beyond concern for their sick compatriots. It confirmed suspicions some had harbored since arrival that American abundance was somehow dangerous, that accepting generosity came with hidden costs. Lucia tried to counter these fears during conversations in the recreation yard, explaining the medical reasoning and emphasizing that the camp was adjusting procedures to prevent future incidents. But trust, once shaken, proved difficult to restore. Women began refusing portions they suspected might be too rich, pushing away foods they had been eating without problem for weeks, creating new tensions between dietary adequacy and prisoner autonomy. Russo found himself mediating disputes that had nothing to do with discipline or security and everything to do with culture and control. One woman insisted on receiving only bread and vegetables, refusing all meat despite the nutritionist's recommendation that she needed protein. Another demanded to cook her own meals, arguing that she knew better than Americans what her body required. A third group petitioned for permission to observe traditional Italian meal patterns rather than eating on the American schedule that felt arbitrary and wrong. Each request was technically reasonable but administratively impossible, requiring exceptions to procedures designed for uniformity and efficiency. The situation reached its breaking point in early October when a delegation of women, led by Lucia, requested a meeting with Colonel Webb. Russo accompanied them to the colonel's office, serving as translator for a conversation that became the most difficult of his assignment. Lucia spoke with the careful diplomacy of someone who understood she was negotiating from weakness but refused to be dismissed. The women appreciated their treatment, she began. They recognized that conditions could be far worse. But they needed Webb to understand that being well-fed prisoners was not the same as being content or even comfortable. Every meal reminded them of families going hungry. Every display of abundance made their captivity more psychologically difficult even as it made them physically healthier. What they requested was simple in concept but radical in implication. They wanted some control over their own sustenance, even if that meant eating less than regulations required. They wanted to establish a small garden where they could grow vegetables using methods familiar from home. They wanted occasional permission to prepare meals themselves, cooking foods that connected them to identities the war had fractured. They were not rejecting American care. They were asking for space within that care to remain themselves. Webb listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When Lucia finished, he asked Russo for his assessment. Russo found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to be honest with a superior whose decisions he could not influence. He told Webb that the women's requests made sense from their perspective, that allowing small autonomous choices might reduce tensions that threatened to grow more serious. But he also acknowledged the complications. Gardens required resources and supervision. Cooking privileges created security concerns. Any exception to standard procedures risked creating precedents that other prisoner groups would demand. The colonel was silent for a long moment, staring out his window at the compound where prisoners moved through their daily routines. When he finally spoke, his words surprised Russo. Webb said he had spent his career believing that good administration meant treating everyone identically, that fairness required uniform application of rules and procedures. But this situation had taught him something about the limits of that approach. These women were not rejecting American values by asking for gardens and cooking privileges. They were trying to maintain human dignity in circumstances that stripped them of nearly everything familiar. If allowing small concessions helped them endure captivity without breaking, then military efficiency should bend to accommodate human need. He approved the garden request immediately, designating a quarter-acre near the women's barracks where they could plant vegetables. He authorized supervised cooking sessions twice monthly where small groups could prepare traditional meals using ingredients the camp would provide. And he agreed to adjust meal schedules to allow for longer dinner periods that approximated Italian dining customs. The concessions were limited but symbolically significant, acknowledgments that prisoners were not merely bodies to be fed but people whose cultural identities deserved respect. The garden became the prisoners' sanctuary. Women who had been teachers and clerks discovered they knew more about cultivation than they realized, knowledge absorbed from parents and grandparents surfacing as they turned desert soil and planted seeds. They grew tomatoes, peppers, basil, zucchini, crops that thrived in Arizona heat and connected them to distant homes. The work was hard but chosen, making it fundamentally different from assigned duties. When the first tomatoes ripened in November, their consumption became a ceremony that Russo witnessed with unexpected emotion. The women gathered at sunset, passing around sliced tomatoes sprinkled with salt they had saved from rations. They ate slowly, savoring flavors that transcended nutrition to become communion with everything they had lost. No one cried this time. Instead, there was quiet satisfaction, a moment of pleasure unmarred by guilt or grief. One tomato, grown by their own hands from their own choices, meant more than 1,000 steaks served by well-meaning strangers. The cooking sessions revealed skills and stories that transformed how Russo understood the women. He watched Lucia demonstrate pasta-making techniques passed through generations, her hands moving with practiced confidence as she explained that every region of Italy had variations, that you could identify someone's origins by how they shaped their dough. He saw younger women learning from elders, knowledge flowing across age gaps as it had for centuries. And he recognized that these sessions were not primarily about food at all. They were about continuity, about maintaining connections to past and future that captivity threatened to sever. December brought news that the war was ending, that Germany's collapse was imminent and Italy's status was shifting from enemy to something more ambiguous. The women would likely be repatriated within months, sent home to a nation destroyed by war and occupation. The prospect created mixed emotions. They wanted desperately to return, to find families and rebuild lives. But they also feared what awaited them, the hunger and devastation that reports suggested had become total. On their final night before the first group departed in January, the women prepared a feast using garden vegetables and ingredients the camp provided. They invited Russo and several other staff members who had shown particular kindness. The meal was modest by American standards but elaborate by theirs, representing hours of collaborative preparation. They served pasta with tomato sauce made from their own tomatoes, bread they had baked, vegetables prepared in traditional styles. And at the end, Lucia made a short speech thanking their hosts while also acknowledging the strangeness of thanking captors for captivity, even kind captivity. Russo responded in Italian, saying what he had come to understand through months of witnessing their struggles. America had tried to demonstrate its values through abundance, through providing plenty that proved democratic prosperity. But the women had taught him that generosity without understanding could become its own form of violence, that the best intentions meant nothing if they dismissed the humanity of those they aimed to help. He hoped they would remember America not for the stakes that had overwhelmed them but for the garden they had planted themselves, for the small spaces of autonomy that had allowed them to remain who they were despite circumstances that threatened to erase them. The women departed in groups through January and February, returning to an Italy that bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. Russo heard nothing from most of them afterward, though Lucia sent a single letter months later describing the devastation she had found in Milan and thanking him for treating them as human beings rather than merely problems to be managed. She closed by noting that her daughters had survived, that she was teaching again, and that she had planted a garden behind her rebuilt apartment building. The seeds, she wrote, came from America. Years later, Russo would reflect on those months and recognize that the story had never really been about food at all. It had been about power and dignity, about the ways that even well-intentioned dominance could wound, about the necessity of allowing people agency over their own lives even in circumstances that stripped away nearly everything else. The stakes had been a mistake born of cultural blindness. The garden had been an apology that acknowledged what the stakes had failed to recognize. And the lesson, hard-won and imperfectly learned, was that victory imposed obligations that went beyond providing material needs to respecting the humanity of those defeated. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.